The introduction of a new aristocracy was one of the most decisive changes arising from the Norman conquest of 1066. Within 2 decades, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was barely existent and replaced by a new ruling French elite. In the early period following William's victory, many English lords retained their lands via submission, but by 1086 there are only 2 English lords of any account. England and Normandy, once 2 separate states, now became a single cross-channel entity, sharing not only a ruling dynasty, but a single Anglo-Norman aristocracy. French became the language of the ruling elite, and castles were built as a symbol of domination. Initially, there may have been no more than 10,000 Normans living amongst 1.2 million others. Castles were therefore vital to ensuring the Norman overthrow and symbolising the new dominance. Here in Bristol today are the remains of a Norman castle erected on the command of William the Conqueror. The new aristocracy was largely carried through by William the Conqueror's inner circle, the noblemen who had fought alongside him at Hastings, and also those from France who had provided material aid to his campaign. William's introduction to the feudal system is perhaps one of the most significant subjects regarding the aristocracy after 1066. The land distributed to William's followers meant these noblemen granted pieces of their land called fiefs to knights in exchange for military service. It will come to define the way in which society was structured for much of the Middle Ages. Before the conquest, English society could be described as divided and non-cohesive. By the time of the conquest, England's ethnically native population, the Britons, had been largely displaced by centuries of invasion, meaning that for a long time society had been driven by foreign cultures. Although unified, England was generally organised into 2 societies. Scandinavian culture was prominent in the northerly situated Danelaw, and more southern areas of the country were influenced by Anglo-Saxon culture. However, after the conquest, English society was split into 2 different peoples, the Normans and the defeated English. David Carpenter suggests that by the early 13th century, the 2 peoples had moulded into one, and everyone was English. The divide had been evident as the Normans believed themselves to be gloriously successful and described their defeated subjects as English unfree peasants. In the winter of 1069, William struck out against the north in retaliation to rebellion. Baker describes this as genocide, as a whole generation was wiped out. The Normans continued on from this, the reforming society by upending 5,000 or so thanes, the backbone of English local society, and placing Normans and others from across the Channel into key positions. The church witnessed changes with heavy adoption of the French language. In one case, a priest at Haselbury actually complained of having to remain silent before the bishop and the archdeacon because he knew no French. One of the biggest changes socially was the introduction of castles into English settlements. The centre of a town or village had now moved from the monastery to the castle, changing how the local population interacted with their sentiment. William placed a knight or a lord in each of these castles to preside over the surrounding area, which in turn introduced a new geographical hierarchy to the settlement, the castle being the epicentre of power and importance, and a person's place in the social pyramid positively correlating with how close they lived to the castle. Although primarily rural, England had a number of old, economically important towns in 1066. A large amount of trade came through the eastern towns, including London, York, Winchester, Lincoln, Norwich, Ipswich and Thetford. Much of this trade was with France, the Low Countries and Germany, but the northeast of England traded with partners as far as Sweden. Cloth was already being imported to England before the invasion through the mercury trade. Some towns, such as York, suffered from Norman sacking during William's northern campaigns. The Norman invasion also brought significant economic changes with the arrival of the first Jews to English cities. William I brought over wealthy Jews from the Roman community in Normandy to settle in London, apparently to carry out financial services for the crown. In the years immediately after the invasion, a lot of wealth was drawn out of England in various ways by the Norman rulers and reinvested into Normandy, making William immensely wealthy as an individual ruler. The minting of coins was decentralised in the Saxon period. Every borough was mandated to have a mint, and therefore a centre for trading in bullion. Nonetheless, there was a strict royal control and coin dies could only be made in London. William retained this arrangement and also maintained a high coin standard, which led to the use of the term sterling for Norman silver. The Domesday Book, 1086, provides us with the most comprehensive survey of the English landscape and society ever executed, and relates the general census today. The Norman Conquest brought in political transformations to England. The Normans had already established political structures in Normandy, which they implemented in England. A cross-channel unit was achieved by removing the old English aristocracy and redistributing English land to French nobles. There was a complete transformation of English politics to French politics. The Normans shifted the structure of kinship by basing it around a narrow lineage system, whereby estates and castles were maintained from generation to the next to limit who could inherit them. Holt supplies, for example, that the distribution of patrimony within kin was sporadic. By the Norman Conquest, special confirmation from the king or lord was required. English kings and landowners created a law of property, which designed the relationships between patronage and inheritance, between the power of the kings and lords to exercise favour to politics or financial advantage. Through inheritance, aristocratic power was maximised, as they could safeguard and extend their interests in the political landscape of the feudal system. For example, they benefited from selecting heirs and brides to maintain and amplify their aristocratic influence. By transmitting land from one generation to the next, the aristocrats were able to distribute land effectively. The feudal system in England was a significant political element that went into shaping the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. Medieval feudalism worked in a top way down. This saw the crown at the top, following the crown were barons, knights and peasants. Each group had to assist whichever group was above them. For example, barons who owned a vast amount of land would give some to a knight. This was known as fief granting. The land granted was able to accommodate the knight and his family, which meant that the knight could be a full-time warrior. Some lords would go on to assemble powerful military forces. The feudal system licensed also magnates to dominate their local administration. Henry I, for example, logged information regarding his magnates, which would include allowances made to them when they attended court. Magnates were wealthy due to their possessions of substantial estates, and some were also councillors of the king or held offices under the crown. This gave them control over local administration. Feudalism provided a structure for the relationships that forged the political climate of the time, and evidently changed the way England was governed. In the early years of William's reign, he was faced with the constant threat of rebellion and unrest from the English. There was an estimated 2 million English to the Normans' tiny population of 10,000, so William could not simply crush the rebels with manpower. The first changes to the English landscape were seen early post-conquest. The Normans imported their superior architecture and used it to their advantage. Castles were built in the countryside to provide a military strongpoint that was used to command Norman dominance over the surrounding area and its people. The large stone buildings were often fortified upon a hill, which provided a view of the local region. They may also have had a psychological effect on the local English, who most likely acknowledged Norman superiority or even feared the imposing structures. The feudal system affected and improved the military. The king could now raise an army quickly and cheaply using the knight service, a system where tenants had to provide the king with one fully armed horseman per fief. Fiefs were usually plots of land or property given to a tenant in return for their allegiance to the crown, which involved military service. A knight was required to serve for 40 days each year. This meant that the army was never short of soldiers. The crown also accepted scutage, a cash payment for each fief instead of a knight. The scutage would then be used to hire mercenaries who would take the knight's place. In larger scale military campaigns, the king hired many mercenaries and would rely on trusted nobles to provide war bands. The development of a modern aristocracy in England was arguably one of the most significant changes that emerged from the Norman Conquest of 1066. The structure of society completely changed due to the destruction and subsequent replacement of existing elites to Norman elites. Once again, the castle was one of the largest driving forces as it transformed the geographical hierarchy, making the castle synonymous with power and influence. Castles were a device with which the Normans could rule effectively, despite numerical inferiority. The English economy, supported by trade and evolved through a centralised currency. The introduction of wealthy Jews allowed for better management of money and greater opportunity to borrow and lend. The innovative measures of the Domesday Book allowed for the economy to be recorded. Nevertheless, the economy was negatively affected through William's harsh, oppressive measures. Feudalism supplied a system for the relationships that was forged within the political landscape during this time, and in due course transformed the way England was governed.